Alright everybody, so in this video we're going to keep going with our discussion of ancient Japan, and we're going to be talking about the Heian period, and from there we're going to transition into the Genpei War and the rise of the samurai. So, typically in a lot of the literature, the Nara and the Heian periods overlap in coverage because there's a lot in common, so that's what we'll be doing in this video. So, the Nara period comes first. It lasts about 710 to about 794, and the Heian period lasts from about 794, 795 to 1185. So in both periods, there are multiple interrelated power structures. So Japanese emperors and aristocrats can gain power and gain legitimacy in politics via the kami worship, so the worship of Japan's indigenous deities, Buddhism, aesthetics, so the gods look with favor upon you because you hold the most cultural objects, stuff like that. Spatial arrangement, your area is austere and august because you have the correct layout as, set about and set up in Chinese classics and Chinese geomancy. Art, bureaucracy, literature, music, etc. All of which culminate in the person of the emperor. But in both periods, there is another system of power that is instituted, and that is the Bushi, the warriors, the people that would eventually become the samurai. So, the Nara period, again, between about 710 and 794, sees a couple different crucial developments. The first is the conquest, or the attempted conquest, anyway, of these people called the Emishi. So, I have a separate dedicated video on the topic for those of you that are interested. But who are the Emishi? So this is not an anthropological term. This is not an ethnic term. Emishi is a political designation. So if you are in the Japanese state, you are Japanese, you are considered to be civilized. If you are outside of it, you are not civilized, you're barbarian, other. These are the Emishi. So the Emishi live in the north of Honshu, so the northern chunk of Japan's largest island. There have been arguments about whether or not they are connected to the Ainu, and it's been heavily debated for the past couple decades. We don't really know. But you could turn from an Emishi into a Japanese by adopting Japanese culture coming into the state, and you are what's known as a transformed one, a transformed individual, because you gave up your barbarous ways and you became Japanese. Culturally, politically, linguistically, etc. We're going to talk more about this when we get to the rise of the samurai, but the Nara period also oversees a theocratic court. So Buddhism comes into Japan in the 500s and 600s, and in the 700s, in this period, Japanese capitals, first Nara and then others, and eventually it culminates in Heian Kyo, the modern-day city of Kyoto. The capitals are designed with Chinese geomancy in mind, and with Buddhist protection ideas in mind. So you are going to go found a capital. Well, you can't just place it anywhere you want. You have to make sure that the first foundation stone is laid on the right day, or the right night, when the stars are aligned properly. It has to be in an area that is austere, and it has to be in an area that is good as far as like feng shui is concerned. So maybe that mountain out in the distance is good because it protects one access to the city whereby evil spirits can't access. But it can't be too far to the left, otherwise it's bad. The city's got to be right next to a creek or a river because it's holy. So you see where this is going. Each city is organized along a grid pattern, but it's placed in very specific areas. And then on top of this, we have the implementation of the rhetorical state, ostensibly to ward off a Tang threat, or a Chinese invasion, hypothetically. So many of the Japanese were scared in this period of a Chinese invasion or a potential Chinese invasion. So we see archaeologically the construction of like forts and fortresses along the Japanese coastline, And the Japanese also institute Chinese ways of doing things. So they combine Confucianism, Buddhism, and the indigenous way of doing religion, so kami worship. And it's with the combination of all this stuff that the emperor, the chief sovereign, becomes the patron of Buddhism and the high priest of Japan's indigenous religious cults. So what we see here is that in this, there's a dual political system. There is the political hierarchy and the religious hierarchy. So there's two different ways of gaining power. And this is something that never really stops in Japan, this idea of a dual power structure. So in this period, it's religion, but once the samurai come into play, it's the emperor versus the shogun versus the head samurai. And each one backs each other up. So this implementation of Chinese culture, Chinese ways of doing things to strengthen the state, make it more centralized, is what's called the rhetorical state. So the rhetorical state is refers rather to the implementation of Chinese civil and criminal code. So rhetorical, civil and criminal law codes coming together to strengthen the Japanese state. And by doing this, the Japanese come up with a new name for themselves, Nihon or Nippon, Sunrise Land, the land of the rising sun. And the title of Tenno, which technically means something like Heavenly Sovereign of the North Star, not really Emperor, in the way that English speakers understand the term, is based off of the Chinese model, and it supersedes the old Japanese way of describing their leader, which is Okimi, Great King, or Big King. But we have a problem with this. So I've mentioned in other videos that Japan was a matriarchal society, or at least it looks like it was. Well, the implementation of Chinese law codes and Chinese ways of doing things means you implement Chinese culture, because these cultural forms and the cultural ways of doing things are what the law codes the Japanese are bringing into Japan were originally set up to do. So you twist the society as well. And I have here two quotes, or two summaries rather, from Mullany's Gender in Modern East Asia, which traces the history of gender since ancient times to the modern day. And the book states that ancient rulers, both female and male, so Japan has this idea, or this system of a dual rulership system, where men and women both take on different aspects of the government. Women carry out religious practices and religious institutions for centuries in Japan, etc. But in China, it's the male that does everything, so when you implement Chinese law, that changes. So that changes relatively quickly. It doesn't really appear to have been too much of a problem with it. Some of it still stays over and lasts into the modern day, like the chief priest of the Ise Shrine of Amaterasu, the Japanese sun goddess, is a female, but stuff like marriage and the way kinship structures are actually organized in terms of how power is expressed in the home and in the family changes a little more slowly. And gradually continental ideas and ways of doing things are blended with indigenous Japanese ways of setting up kinship structures in a way that the political system was not. So when you implement Chinese stuff, one of the things that comes along with that is Confucianism. So Confucianism it's not a religion. You play games like Civilization and things like that, and it's implied to be a religion. It's not. A religion suggests that there is some kind of a deity, there's maybe an afterlife, a heaven, a hell, stuff like that. There's a holy book. Neo-Confucianism, as developed under the Chinese Song Dynasty in the 12th century, yeah, maybe you could look at that as a religion, but old-school Confucianism is not a religion. It's a philosophy and way of doing things to organize the state. So, Confucianism is predicated upon these 5 relationships. Ruler to subject, husband to wife, father to son, elder brother to younger brother, friend to friend. With the exception of friend to friend, the other 4 are hierarchical. And because it is based on Chinese culture, the male is the guy, the male is the one who is in the superior position. Everybody else is beneath him. So, when you start implementing this stuff, you start changing how the Japanese conceive of marriage. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes in a little more detail. But going along with that are changes to imperial governance and marriage patterns more broadly that take Chinese stuff and it ties it up with Japanese aesthetics and Japanese beauty. So the emperor is descended from the kami. Technically speaking, he's descended from the kami Amaterasu, the sun goddess. The first emperor, Jimmu, if he was real, was, according to legend, and if you take this literally, he was commissioned by the gods, by the kami, to pacify and order the land, meaning Japan. So, because of this, the emperor is the head priest. He's the guy who is in charge of convening with the gods and communicating that to the people. So, what happens when you implement Chinese culture and Chinese ways of doing things is that shifts. So, in the emperor's person, rather, we have the unity of nature, so the beauty of the Japanese landscape, aesthetics, so beauty of planned environments, things that you may potentially look at, and it evokes an emotional response in you. So, thousands of years ago, people don't really know what emotions are, so you might think that this response you're getting is because the thing you're looking at has been ordered by the divine, so that kind of thing. And the Japanese way of life, and now the Chinese way of life, all becomes embodied in the person of the emperor. So back to the point I started with originally, beauty becomes deeply connected to how emperors obtain and remain in power. But because of things like Confucianism, it starts changing some stuff in Japanese culture. Well, what exactly does it change and how does it do this? The answer to how this begins to change is largely because the Japanese become literate. The aristocracy, because of the implementation of Chinese culture, law codes, things like that, they have to read. So, I went over this in previous videos, but they learn to read, they learn Chinese, and they also develop a writing system for Japanese. And what this does is because you are, how do I want to put this? Because you are taking traditional Japanese ways of doing things, so this emphasis on the beauty of nature, this emphasis on this feeling of when you look at something that's beautiful, maybe beyond comprehension, you can't really describe it, but you get an emotional response, therefore it must be divine in some way. We'll talk more about that particular thing in a minute, because it's really important with the Heian period. Stuff like that, and this tradition of, oh, I am so moved by this thing that I'm looking at, I'm going to compose a poem because it's the only way I can express myself, gets wrapped up with Chinese culture and Chinese literature. And when Japanese start writing, they record this stuff. So this changes how the Japanese start thinking about the world, as far as the aristocracy is concerned anyway. And it's in this kind of transitionary period between the Nara and the Heian that performing arts, poetry, things like that, start being more generally understood to be something that, well, I am emotionally moved by this. Because I'm emotionally moved by this thing, whatever it is, it must be empowered in some way by the kami, by the gods, and because it's now written down and I can just read it whenever, that emotion keeps coming back up. Well, I want to experience that more and more, so it changes how people start thinking about their religion. And it's in this transitionary period that we get the Manyoshu written. So the Manyoshu is a collection of Japanese poetry. And we're going to talk more about this in the series I have going on Japanese nationalism, but I'll touch upon it here. It's all about flowers, and it's all about nature and the beauty of nature, stuff like that. This is made possible through the introduction of Chinese culture because you can now write. And in the 17 and 1800s, when Japanese nationalists are looking around, they're like, well, we have all this influence from China, but we have this record, thanks to Chinese writing, of how our ancient ancestors understood the world. It's nature, it's emotion, it's pure. Well, therefore, so Japanese nationalists argued, using stuff like the Manyoshu from this period, because the emphasis is on emotion, and because in East Asian philosophical thought, you have the yin yang, you have male energy, which is artificial, it's created, balanced by female energy, which is natural, it's spontaneous. Well, because Japanese culture in the ancient period had stuff like that was natural and spontaneous, Japanese is superior to Chinese culture. So I bring this up because of the writing of stuff like the Manyoshu. Basically enables later generations to look at ancient Japan as a period of purity, where emotion is like the thing you draw upon, and it makes modern Japan superior to modern China, which leads to stuff like the Sino-Japanese War. And we'll get into that more in the nationalism series. But my point is that the Manyoshu really speaks to this blending of Chinese and Japanese culture, because you have a Chinese system of writing combined with a Japanese emotive sense, and it's now written down so future generations can experience it. So this is the big thing in the Nara period. It's the implementation of Chinese culture and applying it to Japan. And you get this really quite beautiful blending in terms of intellectual and cultural history of everything this period now develops. And it's with this that we move into the Heian period. So the Heian period roughly goes between about 794 and 1185, so the end of the Genpei War. And it's in this period as well that, much like the Nara period, the emperor is at the apex of the system of beauty, power, multiple hierarchies exist for gaining political influence, political legitimacy, social legitimacy, so you are better than somebody else because you know more about Buddhism. You're maybe blessed by the Buddha. You're wealthy enough you can found a monastery and have people pray for you. Or you understand the kami in a way that other people don't. Or you know more about spatial arrangement. You can arrange flowers in a certain way that maybe is more pretty than somebody else can. Stuff like that. This is the power structure of the Heian court. This is going to contrast very strongly with the samurai when we get to them in the next video. And much like the Nara period was centered on the city of Nara, the capital of Japan in the Heian period is Heian Kyo. So Heian Kyo is the last permanent capital of Japan that's really founded before they switch capitals to Tokyo in the 1800s. So Heian Kyo is the capital until 1868. It is modeled on the Tang Chinese capital of Chang'an, but with a couple differences. So much like the city of Chang'an, or any Chinese city really that's planned, the city is a rectangle. It's oriented in a north-south direction. The palace is in the northern center, so there's Chinese reasons for this, but there's also Japanese reasons. So the emperor is associated with the North Star, so of course you're going to put the palace in the north, so it's under Polaris. There's, coming out of the palace, an avenue that runs to the south that divides the city in half, etc. It's organized in a grid pattern. But unlike Chinese cities, there's not really an emphasis on walls or defensive fortifications in Heian Kyo. Yes, technically speaking, there is a wall with, I'd have to double check, I want to say there's 8 gates, but there is a wall. It is not a defensive perimeter, at least not initially. Eventually, it is fortified to a degree, but initially it's like a 6-foot-high wall. It's just like a ceremonial boundary marker for the city. That's all it is. Alright, so what you are looking at here in the bottom right corner of the screen is a general grid layout of Heian Kyo. So this big kind of rectangle to the north, that's where the Imperial Palace complex is. You see the thick black line running down the middle. That is the dividing line, that is the dividing avenue in the city. So you see it's organized in a grid pattern. The site topography of Heian Kyo was chosen because it was auspicious. It accorded very well with Chinese methods of geomancy and feng shui. So there's a river on the east, there's a highway on the west, so it's boundaried by 2 areas that are believed in Japanese folklore and mythology to have kami on them, so it's cool. Mount Hiei is in the north, so as far as Buddhism is concerned, this is a holy mountain. Hiei Monastery is founded on Mount Hiei, so that you have Buddhist monks and a monastic structure, a monastic complex to basically offer prayers for the city and to prevent the intrusion of Oni and other demons and malevolent spirits from that direction into the city. Of course, these monks also do terrorize the city sometimes, but we'll talk about that later. And there's marshy lowlands on the south. So this is a fertile area. Yeah, it has some disease, but it's a fertile area, so it's cool. So this is why Heian Kyo is chosen to be placed where it is. However, despite the pleasantness of the landscape, the weather makes it suck. So in the summer, it's hot, it's muggy, the winters are often well below freezing, and the city is basically laid out in a 3.3 mile by 2.8 mile division, running north-south, east to west. It's approximately a third the size of Chang'an, the Tang Chinese capital. But these earthen walls, I mentioned a minute ago, and I want to touch on this more for a minute. It's 6 feet high at the inner wall and 8 feet high at the outer wall. Like I said, these aren't an obstacle. These are not like defensive perimeters. These are just boundary markers. They do eventually get fortified, to a degree, but not really. Maybe there's 200 buildings in the palace complex, so this is a fairly large area. And the palace complex is designed and constructed in such a way to basically allow the court aristocracy to experience Japan without leaving. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Japan is a beautiful landscape. It's a beautiful country. So you take that beautiful landscape and you put it inside the Imperial complex. So there's artificial hills, there's artificial lakes, there's artificial streams, etc. There's gardens. You experience nature without ever really leaving the city. And the government offices, as far as this area is concerned, are in the south. The Imperial offices, the Imperial residence, is in what's believed to be the more august area, which is in the north. So this is the basic layout of Heian Kyo, modern-day Kyoto. Now, in this period, the emperor is not a despot. He is not somebody who is able to give an order, necessarily, and basically have it be followed no matter what. The emperor is more concerned here with religious ceremonies. So what the emperor is supposed to do in this period is have a religious function to ensure a general welfare and the welfare of the state. So he's the incarnation of a kami, of a divinity. So he's the arbiter of social status. He's the guy that basically gives everybody their ranks, and then they rule for him. And the social status of individuals, of court aristocracy in Heian Kyo, basically corresponds to how distant they are from the emperor, both in terms of how physically distant they are, in terms of, like, where they work, and also in terms of birth. So where do you rank on the totem pole? This is going to affect your rank in the court. This is going to affect what duties you have, who you can talk to, how you communicate, how you write your poetry, etc. After the early Heian period, the emperor basically develops a lot of prestige, but they don't really have a lot of power. So this is why this thing, we'll talk about this more later, this is why this thing called the Insei system developed. So basically what happens is, well, the emperor is supposed to be in charge of, like, religious function. That's their job. Well, if you say, I don't want to be emperor anymore, I have a kid, and you're like, I want to retire and be a monk, I want to pursue learning and increase my piety, you can do that. And if you retire, you're out of this system, but because you're a retired emperor, you still have some power and you've got some strings to pull. So the Insei system develops retired emperors who basically let their kids do the rituals and stuff for them, and then they pull the strings behind the scenes. So this is how multiple power structures in the Heian period develop. And just as a note here, the Heian period is pretty much just male emperors. So this is where Chinese culture and Chinese institutions and ways of doing things basically impact this. So in China, it's patriarchal. women don't have a lot of power in this period. So when Japan implements Chinese law codes and Chinese ways of doing things, well, empresses kind of fall by the wayside, and it's the males that take over. The Imperial family is a pretty large clan. Up until about 798, it includes, by law, male and female descendants of the emperor down to the 5th generation. However, the Heian period changes this because of the implementation of Chinese law codes and Chinese culture. So now it's really the male that is in charge of everything. But there are issues with the implementation of this beyond the imperial family. Among the court aristocracy, so by the early 10th century, we have a few more than 700 people with imperial family titles, getting government support. So it's like we have that on the one hand, and then we have actual non-related people that are the aristocracy. So about 100 to 125 men and their families, or 1 or 2% of the overall population. They are not quite so bounded by Chinese cultural systems. We're going to talk about this in a minute, but what I want to emphasize here is that the court aristocracy doesn't really fight each other, not really. There's very little violence at the top, and there's little opportunity for discontented people to kind of play off of high authorities, mainly because of the court rank system. You can't do anything unless the emperor tells you to, unless he grants you the ability to go up or down in rank. You are bounded by where you are born and what rank you have. So what you do, who you talk to, how you dress, etc. is all about your social status. And every single thing you do in that social status is highly ritualized, and it's highly watched over and highly judged by everybody else. So going along with this court aristocracy and the imperial family, what we see in the Heian period, in the capital city, is the importance of patron-client relationships. So basically what this eventually results in is that a lot of attention gets paid to high figures, the people that are the patrons, and the clients do what they can to get prestige, and they do what they can to kind of further their stations in life, but not really. They don't really move up too much. This also reinforces the hierarchies developed by the implementation of the Chinese system of court ranks. And this system of court ranks, okay, and I cannot stress this enough, because this is going to contrast very strongly with the samurai, is very closely aligned with a hierarchy of virtue that comes from hierarchy of status, wealth, your knowledge of the Buddhist Sutra, stuff like that. So the emperor's at the top because they're the guy that communes with the kami, with Japan's indigenous deities. The elite are incredibly virtuous because of their actions in past lives. So according to Buddhism, you wouldn't get to this place if you had bad karma. So in the past life, you must have done something right to be born into the aristocracy. So we see here Buddhism is impacting how the system develops and how it is ordered. And going along with this, people pride themselves on their knowledge of Chinese culture. And going along with that knowledge of Chinese culture is this whole idea of karma. So this whole thing is based off of what? Shinto, what becomes Shinto, Buddhism, Confucianism, things that argue that they are basing themselves on an order found in nature. So the spatial arrangement of Heian Kyo shows the natural order of things if you were to leave the city. The way the court aristocracy is ordered supposedly shows the natural way of doing things. So all of this stuff gets tied up with more and more Chinese philosophies of Taoism, the yin yang, etc. So basically, what eventually happens is that if there's a problem with somebody, like if you dishonor yourself, if you're foolish, if you act like a bumpkin, something that basically brings shame to you and your family, it's believed to be a problem that you have, or that your family has, because of bad karma, because you pissed off a god, something like that, and it doesn't reflect a problem with the system. This is key here. The system is pure. The system's intact. If there's a problem, it's with you, not the way this is set up. Because China uses it this way, and China has lasted a lot longer than Japan, so they must be doing something right. So we bring that in to the Japanese court culture, then we should be cool. We should have a stable system. However, at the same time, there are natural disasters, there are famines, there is war, there stuff like that we read in the records. So this reflects problems with the emperors or later people, not the system itself. Now, with all of that in mind, these people, I hope I've made it clear, are very concerned with, their own rank in society. They're concerned with nature. They're concerned with the way things are ordered and structured and everything based on Chinese culture. Well, these guys don't leave the city. So, if you don't leave the city, how do you support yourself? How do you ensure you have food? Well, basically, the nobility are, I went over in previous videos, given land rights and legitimacy to claiming certain kinds of land by the emperor. So it's in the interest of the emperor, and it's in the interest of the aristocracy to basically support each other. So, the estates that these people own gradually develop into this thing called shogun. So shogun are not really manors in the medieval European sense. These are large estates that you basically, if you're an aristocrat, you don't go visit because why would you want to leave the capital city? It's the most glorious place on earth, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But you need a way to have the estate governed and run. So what do? Well, you hire a land steward. You hire somebody to go do it for you. And the gradual result is that the court nobility becomes disconnected with the land they own, and they pay more and more people to go manage it for them. Now, on top of that, there were land reclamation projects. So, you're an aristocrat, you have this chunk of land. Maybe you want to go get this chunk of land. And you reclaim it. You drain the swamp, you cut down the forest, stuff like that, whatever. You get the land back somehow. Well, is this now part of your land? Well, there were two ways you could answer this. You could be, yeah, it's my land. Or you could say, no. It's not my land. I reclaim this land, and I'm giving it to a Buddhist monastery to pray for me because it gives me good karma. So, gradually throughout the Heian period, we also see the rise of Buddhist monasteries in wealth and power because they're getting all this land. There are also tax issues with this. Peasants that own their own land under the rhetorical state had to pay taxes. It was cheaper to commend land to monasteries and to nobles who would take it over for them, and they just till the soil rather than actually trying to pay the taxes. So out in the countryside, there's a series of problems that are developing with land. And we'll talk about this in the next video in more detail. So that's what's going on kind of out in the countryside. In the city, in Heian Kyo, where the nobility doesn't leave, there is the rise of court culture, and there's the gradual alteration of marriage lines along Chinese grounds due to the implementation of Chinese culture. So, the Heian nobility, the males, the first time they married a female that was the same age or older, and then later on in their second marriage, because this is just what they did, the male was older in the second marriage. So what this gradually develops, because you're marrying multiple times, is polygamy. So it's a system where you have one husband, but you have more than one wife. So the first wife appears to have been the principal one. But here's the thing with this. You have multiple wives. Women could not have multiple husbands, but husbands had multiple wives. So because you're marrying all these women, and you're getting all these dowries, and you have all these different in-laws, well, what does that mean for the raising of the family? And the answer basically is that the family lines are bilateral. So you trace descent through both the mother and the father. But the interesting thing is that those marriages are also uksor local. So it's the husband who has to go to the wife's family, not the other way around. And gradually, it develops into something that is called dual local marriage, where the husband is married to his wife, but he lives in his parents' house, but he has to go visit his wife at her parents' house. So this matters for the following reason. In the first marriage, like we went over, it's often uxor local. The second marriage is often dual local, so the husband stays at his parents' home, visits his wife in her parents' home, and the children are largely raised in the wife's house. So the maternal grandfather is the person that gradually exerts more and more influence on the grandchild. So, going forward, as the Fujiwara family is marrying themselves into the Imperial family, and as there are cadet branches of the Imperial family, all this system of marriage largely begins to be instituted, and very key political players who are rather old start gaining influence over the real movers and shakers of Japanese politics and Japanese society. So think about, Game of Thrones. We have Peter Baelish. He wants to be behind the scenes. We have Varys, who wants to be behind the scenes. These are the puppet masters. These are the guys pulling the strings. So in this system of marriage, the maternal grandfathers are basically filling this role. Yeah, the emperor is in charge. The emperor goes on the throne. But because the Fujiwara are marrying their daughters into the imperial family, therefore the emperor-to-be goes and lives with his mother's family. So the Fujiwara grandfather is the guy that's able to mold the emperor. So you see where this is going. So despite this prevalence of Chinese ways of doing things and the impact and influence of Chinese culture whereby the male is the person really in charge, systems of marriage like this really speak to the continued influence or potential influence that females had in Japanese court society. And it's with this in mind, this potential impact of women in mind, that we gotta move forward and talk about Chinese culture in the Heian period, in the Heian court. By the way, women could also buy and sell property in this period, which is huge, because that stops later on once the samurai really come to power. So the wife retains her clan name at marriage. She's buried with members of her birth clan, so she's not considered a member of her husband's clan, not really. She has the right to divorce, keep her children in cases of the husband's death or divorce, but she's still, technically speaking, because of the impact of Chinese court culture, she's inferior to the position of male nobles at court. So I realize I've been going on for a while about this subject now, but before we close the video, I just want to mention one or two more things. Specifically what I want to talk about is the court culture of the Heian period, and I want to talk about the Tale of Genji for a few minutes. So, as we've gone over earlier in the video, the Imperial Palace structure, complex, whatever term you want to use to define it, was basically designed in such a way as to bring the landscape of the Japanese islands into the city, so that the aristocracy didn't have to leave to go experience the Japanese islands. So there are, artificial ponds, streams, creeks, forests, etc., all within the Imperial Palace structure. So what this does for the court culture of the Heian period is basically two things that kind of get meshed together. So it builds upon older Chinese ways of viewing the world, and it combines that with the supposed natural beauty that is the Japanese islands, or that are the Japanese islands, and basically what it results in is a flourishing of artistic and literary development in the imperial palatial complex, where basically the emphasis is on things that are natural, beautiful, all of which can be summed up in this current mindset as good. So evil and things associated with evil, like pollution, leaving the natural order. So, for example, the aristocracy's example of that would be wanting to, like, leave the palatial complex, because why would you want to do that? Then you're out in the middle of nowhere, you're away from civilization. So what gets emphasized in the literature and the music and the poetry, everything that's developed, especially the paintings, in the Heian period by the court aristocracy are things you would basically find in nature. So this builds on earlier stuff from the Nara period, like the Manyoshu. So we have more poems and more collections of poems, pretty much all about things like flowers, mountains, the sunrise, the sunset. And the love of poetry goes to such an extent that basically if you are an aristocrat and you go to greet somebody or say goodbye or pay a compliment, something like that, you do so in the form of a poem. So it's in this period that we get one of, if not the oldest actual literary tales in the Japanese language. So I don't mean like a collection of poetry, I mean like an actual story. And that is the Takatori Monogatari, the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, which we have tentatively dated to the late 9th century, like I've mentioned previously. So every culture has its own literature, its own pieces that their students, their population, basically learned in the public school system. So if you are an American or you're from the United Kingdom, there's a very good chance you know Shakespeare. Well, the Japanese know the Takatori Monogatari, among other things. And this exerts such an influence on Japanese culture that there is actually an anime version of it, which was produced in 2013. So my point with this is that a lot of the oldest literature we have from Japanese civilization comes from this period, and the striking thing about this basically is the following. So in this period, as we've gone over, the situation of men and women is basically changing in accordance with the introduction and adoption of Chinese laws, Chinese culture, Chinese ways of doing things, which emphasize the male. But many, if not the great majority, of the literature and poetry produced by the Heian aristocracy looks like it was done by women. So why is this important? Well, on the one hand, it reflects the continued elevated status of women, even though they were, technically speaking, below men in the court. They still have a lot of influence, and it also shows that they have access to education and information. They were able to read and write, because while they can do it in classical Chinese, what's really important here is that most of the stuff is written in Japanese. So there's that continued push away from continental influence and going back to the indigenous way of doing things, the Japaneseness. So the pendulum is swinging away from the mainland and going back to the Japanese islands. So it's in this general environment that we have what looks like, or what we think is, the world's first actual novel produced in about the year 1000. So the Tale of Genji is supposedly the world's first novel. People fight about this a lot, not only historians, but scholars of ancient literature. They compare Genji, written in the year 1000, to Roman texts like the Golden Ass, written about 800 or 900 years before, some Eastern Roman stuff written in the 500s and 600s, but by and large, much of the consensus falls on the Genji side of the equation, because Genji is over 1,000 pages. It has hundreds of characters, who all of whom have 1,000,001 names. Like, there are some characters that show up early on, and then you never see them again, or you maybe see them at the end of the story under a different name. So every character has different names, and what this reflects is the actual world of the Heian court, where everybody, based upon their social rank, had different names they went by based on the occasion. Now, as far as using Genji as a primary source to gain insight into the world of the Heian period court, there are problems with this, like there would be with any source. It's a novel, so we shouldn't read it literally, but part of the way you use stuff like novels and comedy and jokes, so, memes in the modern day would definitely fall into this method of analysis, is that in order for things like jokes and references, etc., to be found humorous or to be understood by the people that it's being directed at, there has to be some kind of a base level of actual real-world understanding. So because Genji was aimed at the court aristocrats, and because Genji emphasizes things like the lack of violence, aesthetics, finding peace and love in beauty, in nature, stuff like that, we can infer that these are things and these are values that the court aristocracy basically would have held. And this really gets summed up pretty well by this phrase, mono no aware. So what this means is, and it gets translated differently, it means something like the transience of things or the transience of life, etc. So basically what this is when you view something beautiful or you are sad to a degree that is beyond, I'm just mopey today. Maybe you're feeling much more morose. Maybe you are extremely elated, you're happy, maybe you're extremely livid, right? You're angry. So you have all these different emotions. Emotions are felt to come from the body and come up. So no matter what you're feeling, you feel that emotion around your heart, in your stomach, in your head. So my point is you feel the emotion within you. So when you are moved by something, this emotion wells up and it comes out. And the way the Heian aristocracy conceived of that and the way they dealt with it was mono no aware. So the transience of things or life, basically what that means is you are moved by the beauty of a flower or a poem or something that basically makes you realize that the world is mortal and you're going to die one day. So you take value, you place value in beauty, in art, in culture, things that evoke emotional responses. So the feeling basically is that if you're going to rank it in terms of the human experience, that stuff is up here. So that's, in a nutshell, what mono no aware is. And Genji's full of this. It's full of people going on like expeditions or journeys into the Imperial gardens to look at flowers, and then sometimes they're so moved by a specific plant, they just compose a poem, what basically eventually long-term develops into stuff like haiku, off the top of their head. Because they're so moved by the beauty of whatever it is they're looking at, that's how they express it. So that, in a nutshell, is the Tale of Genji. I will warn you, if you want to read it, I have tried twice. Twice I have failed. It's so big and it's so dense and there's so many characters that basically there have been like reading guides produced for how to actually go through it. The last thing I want to kind of just cover and sum up briefly is that the aristocracy, the people doing the actual culture, the people making the literature and the poetry and the painting, etc., these are only a few thousand people. Most of them are involved in some way with the daily routines of governance. So these are bureaucrats, but in their spare time they are producing all this literature and other cultural objects. However, only a fraction of the stuff actually survives. So we know significantly less than we would like about this period due to the scarcity of sources. But what we do have surviving tells us very strongly that in order to really do this, you need to have a very strong education and you need a very strong background in language, specifically classical Chinese and what becomes classical Japanese. Because there are thousands and thousands of characters you have to know. So if we can sum up Heian court aristocratic culture in a word, basically it's, well, I'm so well educated, and I'm better than you because I know more about this painting than you do, or I can recognize this song in 2 or 3 beats and you can do it in 5. I'm better than you because I can compose a more moving poem on the fly than you can. So this basically is what the court aristocracy is like. This is what they do. In the next video, we're going to talk about the Genpei War and the rise of the samurai, and we're going to see very quickly that the values of the warriors, the people that eventually become the samurai, clash and stand in stark contrast to the values of the court aristocracy. So until then, I realize this has been something of a long video. Hopefully you've stuck around. If you have, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it enlightening, and I will see you all next time.